Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several questions for you, Mr. Shulman and Mr. Miller. And for me, the basic proposition is simple. Notwithstanding the troubling and unacceptable conduct of the IRS, if political organizations do not want to be scrutinized by the government, they shouldn't seek privileges like tax-free status and anonymity for their donors. To argue otherwise is to advantage tax cheats to the detriment of law-abiding Americans. That's why my hope is that out of this debate will come clear and enforceable rules that treat all political groups equally. So with respect to questions, Mr. Miller and Mr. Shulman, the lines have blurred between political active groups that disclose their donors, those are the 527s, and those who do not, those are the 501c4s. And it has become apparent that organizations that ought to be 527s are applying for C4 status to avoid disclosure obligations. That means there is an incentive for people to choose their tax status based on whether they want to hide their donors. My view is that's a loophole the Congress ought to close. Given that to be exempt from federal income tax, Section 501c4 of the Code requires nonprofits to operate exclusively, as opposed to substantially or primarily, for the promotion of social welfare. My question to the two of you, Mr. Shulman and Mr. Miller, why was this problem not corrected? Mr. Shulman.
Senator, could you just
lines,
clarify the problem?
Yeah, the lines blurred. The lines have blurred between the 527s and the 501c4s, so there's an incentive for people to choose their tax status based on whether they want to hide their donors. I think it's real straightforward. The line's blurred, and you all don't seem to have done anything about it, and I want to know why not.
Well, look, let me state that I think the law in the tax-exempt area is very complex, like the rest of our—
Mr. Shulman, we understand all that. Why didn't you do anything on your watch to correct it?
So let me continue. The Treasury regulations that the IRS staff in Cincinnati was wrestling with in this case are long-standing regulations. I believe they're 40-plus years
50.
Old.
50.
And I did see that the Inspector General in his report recommended that Treasury ought to look at the regulations. I heard the chairman say he was going to look at this, and all I can say is that this is a very hard task given to the IRS. To have the IRS, which needs to process 140 million tax returns and get billions of dollars refunds out to people every year, to also have them have this piece of the operation that by the law has to be asking questions about political activities is very difficult. And so from where I sit as a former IRS commissioner, if Congress could help clarify the law, that would be a very helpful thing.
Mr. Miller, same question. What did you do to correct this problem on your watch?
So we have put out some guidance, but not enough. I mean, the issues are several-fold. One is we get 70,000 applications for exemption a year. The number of those that are C4s is much less, but even those have doubled over the last few years. There is no doubt that since 2010, when Citizens United sort of released this wave of cash, that some of that cash headed towards C4 organizations. That's proven out by FEC data and IRS data. That does put pressure on us to take a look. As I had mentioned earlier, 527 organizations can do all the politics they want to do. 501c4 organizations have a limited ability to do politics. When organizations choose Plan B, the 501c4 option, it's our obligation to go in and look hard at whether they meet those requirements or could be a 527 organization. But in fact, we would have to talk, and I'm sure staff will come up and work you through. There are some issues in the law now. You can't convert, or we cannot convert a 501c4 organization into a 527 organization at this point, I don't believe.
Yeah,
that's a legal issue.
What troubles me is on your watch, when the lines are blurring on this disclosure issue, as far as I can tell, you all didn't do anything to correct the problem in a meaningful way. and I think that's very regrettable. Now, let me ask about one other issue for the future going forward. The IRS and the Inspector General agree on a number of reform proposals, but the IRS does not support one of the most important, and that's developing and making public clear guidance for processing potentially political cases. Now, even the best training doesn't prepare employees to fairly apply ambiguous rules. In the absence of clear guidelines, the country is in effect left to the whims of the bureaucracy. Wouldn't it make sense to have those knowledgeable about political campaigns and campaign finance work with the IRS to develop clear and enforceable guidelines that are really at the intersection of these two areas, campaign finance and tax law? Wouldn't it make sense to get two agencies, particularly the Federal Election Commission and the IRS, working together under congressional and public oversight at this point? Either one of you. Start with you, Mr. Shulman.
Look, it sounds reasonable to me, but I don't direct what the IRS does now, so I can't speak for what the IRS should be doing at this point.
Mr. Miller?
I divide the world into two pieces. Should we do guidance? Absolutely. There's a different sort of issue that was involved in the TIGTA report that we ought to take a look at again anyway, and I agree on that. That was whether there's some sort of guide sheet, some sort of template that we could do to move these cases forward, I believe. And there, the concern of those involved, and I was not, is that these cases are very fact-specific, and that may not be possible. But I do think, given all of this, we ought to work with TIGTA. And
My time is up, but they are fact-specific, but the Inspector General is right. We can get more expertise if we start bringing in people who are knowledgeable about election law. This was another failure, in my view, in terms of what the problems are that we're dealing with now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. I might say